Okay. Yes, I suppose so. Ha ha ha. Suppositions. What are they called? Subordinate clauses. Yes, and semicolons. And yes, I'm telling you, man. Yeah. Well, yeah. Oh, and now that you see, you take it and make it vulgar each time. All right. Okay, sure. And thanks always. Okay. Yes, it's a legendary figure that we're going to open up. It's a legendary figure we are going to open up this theater of words toward. It's going to be a theater of the open word, and the subject is going to be Artaud. The thought of Artaud, um, the character and the destiny of Artaud, the legend of Artaud, and the mystique of Artaud. And so, on the level of like the linear calendar, um, we're talking about the legendary French auteur, the author of works that transcended many, many genres, as well as a persona or a mystique or a legend or a life story that exemplifies so much that is fascinating and dangerous about romanticism, about literary romanticism, artistic romanticism, French romanticism, and the realm of the irrational. But I want to highlight, if possible, the storyteller, the one who recounts the motion of thought in his consciousness and performs it in a real dramatic way, an actor, actually. So, Artaud and the theater would be something that we could start with. He arrived in Paris and worked in many of those extremely creative theatrical companies that there were in Paris. And he worked in those theaters at a time when, among so many other significant things, but the way that the actors taught themselves, the way that the actors taught each other, the discipline of the actors began to become something that was really creative in itself. I mean, the very process of actors educating each other for the work of the stage and the life of the stage, that it was the total way to connect with all of life as an artist that um, Artaud sought. You see, that was what was coming out of him, driven out of him by a compelling force. You see, from the beginning, it is said, Artaud suffered. Um, it is said, well, he was the eldest in a family. I think there were 8 children, no, 5 children, of which 2 lived. Um, and he suffered from meningitis at the age of 5. And at that time, it was very fortunate that he survived that. But after that, he had headaches, and you know, the word back then that they used was neurasthenic, and so from early on, he was, it's the archetype of the strange and the gifted child, um, the intense child, praying in his room all day long, wanting to be a priest, and then renouncing God. Um, Educated in Marseille, he was born in Marseille. Um, both of his parents were from Turkey, from Smyrna, from the Anatolia Peninsula. His grandparents were first cousins. All of these things. These are part of the little cards of fact and detail that make up, the nest out of which, the phoenix of the persona of Artaud emerges. Anyway, so he's suffering from headaches and neurasthenic, and well, so he began to spend time in institutions. I don't know when the first time that he was sent to an institution or became subject to whatever special treatment there was for that kind of thing, which there was, of course. And already, Foucault, among so many French theorists, Michael Foucault and his history of authoritarian systems and madness and civilization and all these things, Artaud is always a central kind of exemplary character in those kind of themes, because he's the institutionalized one, the sensitive, the gifted, and the troubled one. And of course, it is said, perhaps as early as at the age of 13, but certainly by his early 20s, laudanum was administered as something that could help his nervous condition and his headaches and things. So after that, it was very much a part of his life for a large portion of the time. That he was addicted to that stuff, and that too, of course, that was the way he medicated himself, and it's easy to see that's familiar as a character, who's managing their own condition on the level of their mental health, in that way, and but also at the same time, in the midst of that, there was a creative psychologist or therapist named Dr. Toulouse, who, I don't know how they were connected up with Artaud as a child, but they were connected up, and he noticed that he was able to see Artaud. He was able to see Artaud, but not in terms of his diagnosis or his condition or his case history. He was able to see that Artaud was a creative thinker. And so because of that, he played a role I'm sure that was where Artaud got the nurturing, the spiritual or mental or the teaching, the education that he needed to begin to find his way with his strange personality. And he was, during the First World War, he spent a very short time inducted into the French army, but he didn't stay there long. It is said he was discharged for sleepwalking or neurasthenia or these kind of things. And so somewhere in that time, from 1920 to 1936, I would say, he was associated in Paris in the theater world, and that is where some of the real feeling, for the ideas, we can begin to look at some of the more abiding themes that we want to look at when we study Artaud, because there it was in theater that he learned an ascesis, that he sought and found a discipline, in other words, an ascesis. That word also, our word ascetic comes from that, a form of discipline of each day to connect the whole of his life energies, the whole of his character, the whole of his gifts to a form of artistic practice. And so the ascesis for Artaud was the training of an actor. And that was a time when his first employer was the French director Charles Dullin, Dullin, and a known figure in French theater. And Artaud came to them as he was known as a writer, and then as he became more and more connected to them, he began to play all kinds of roles for them: stagehand and author, actor. And the exercises were the Stanislavskian exercises. Artaud's ascesis, Artaud's discipline, begins and manifests further there in a living space among people. And what comes out keeps on coming out. And that's another thing about Artaud and his mystique. What comes out, and whatever form itself stands in the way of this kind of energy. And so, it's more than iconoclastic. It's destructive, so to speak, because of how he conducts himself. Like, for example, in the exercises. I'll tell you this. I want to quote Dolan about Artaud. Dolan was just like Dr. Toulouse, Dolan was one of his mentors as a director. And Dolan said that Artaud, he really took to those Stanislavskian exercises. And well, I'll find it eventually. But to paraphrase it, Dolan said that Artaud took to the Stanislavskian exercises, especially improvisation. And I'll just quote it rather than leaf through my notebook here. But Artaud himself took to the improvisational exercises so much that, as he wrote later in his journal, as Artaud wrote later in his journal, that he began to think with his soul, to think through his soul. He said improvisation and the whole Stanislavskian thing, he spoke about it as the Russians. The Russians taught me to think through my soul. And that's Artaud talking about the effect of the Stanislavskian methods of teaching that he learned on the stage working in the company of Charles Dolan's theater group, 10 hours a day for a long time, And of course, but Dolan also said, but what he didn't, he was so gifted, he brought so much to our improvisational exercises, but he, in a very pointed way, he would not do the repetitive diction exercises. Now, there are those who said that Artaud suffered from nervous tics and things like this, which gave him that, unique and strange kind of aspect that he was to call upon naturally from himself on the stage in oh so many ways. But in order to access that, it became such that he refused to do like the repetitive exercises. He would not, it became extreme. He would not, on principle, make the same gesture twice or take the same approach to a role more than once, because he felt it was not to be called for in the sacred space of the theater and in his conception of it. And so his last role on the stage with Charles Dolan, he was playing the Emperor Charlemagne, and he made his entrance crawling, dressed like a businessman in a Chinese mask toward the throne. And this was totally unexpected. And Dolan said to him after, that was a little bit too stylized. And Artaud said something like, if it's realism you want, oh well, And so, but did it alienate? Well, it alienated many. And then he went to other theaters and he worked with all of them. And he worked with so many of them. And was he impossible to work with? Sometimes, yes. But other times, very, very inspiring. People really felt his expressive gift. It was like he was someone who was completely vulnerable and idealistic, and yet at the same time, fanatical and rigid and authoritarian, but in his own kind of unique kind of way. The strictness and the rigor of ascesis, you see, the skill of the artist, and the intensity, which was part of Artaud's character, came out in this way. But also, and this is more important, really, Artaud, yes, I've talked even already perhaps too much about his extreme character. But if we want to really look at the Artaud as a real rich and warm and life-giving teacher, there are ways we can find it straight from the words of his own mouth as a writer. Now, it is not given to us to see Artaud live in the flesh. There's lots of YouTube imagery out there. But it is given to us through Artaud's vast body of writings in all forms, poetry and screed and letter and essay and lecture. It is given to us to have access to his own thought in his own words about the things that he did. And so This is a lecture that he gave. This is from a lecture that he gave upon soon after arriving in Mexico. I haven't talked about that yet, about when Artaud was about 40. After a stint in these theaters, after appearing in as many as 20 films, silent films, most notably, most classically, Carl Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc, where Artaud plays plays Mathieu Ricard, a monk who was one of her, who was a bailiff who appeared at her trial and was there, at her immolation. And you see the eyes and the face of Artaud, and you see sternness, disdain, compassion, identification, anguish, companionship, all just through his face in these close-ups. It's a classic film. Also, Renee Falconetti, she played Joan of Arc, and she too has her legend also. Long, intense close-ups of faces, and that is the mask of Artaud. That is Artaud, the actor, available to us. But let's pay attention to Artaud, as I said, the teacher, the writer, where we can touch the concept of Artaud, the concepts Artaud wanted to express, the mythical, poetic concepts with all the energy of poetry that he expresses as his own personal recollected history. In this lecture, shortly after arriving in Mexico, after arriving in Mexico, he spoke at the university in Mexico City. And what the audiences wanted to know really from him, because he already had something of a reputation, they wanted to know about theater in France and all this. Artaud himself, he wanted to get to the hinterlands. He wanted to get to the canyonlands. He wanted to be with the people of the soil, searching for the wholeness of the original mystic and sacred ceremony. And he did go there, and we have the writing from that also. But let's look at some of this, and we can see some of the beginnings of these ideas. Artaud wrote and spoke in this lecture entitled Post-War Theater in Paris, delivered in Mexico City in about 1936. He said, "In the post-war theater movement in France, I will try to discern a movement that is both that of the theater and that of the French spirit. For this, it would not be sufficient to have attended all the shows which from 1920 to 1936 left their mark on Paris, but I can say that I was involved in the intimate life of the theater, in its troubles, in its failures, its hopes, its difficulties, and sometimes also its triumphs. I have worked as an actor or director in no less than 10 theaters, the Oeuvre, the Atelier, the Vieux Colombier, the Comédie des Champs-Élysées, the Studio des Champs-Élysées, the Théâtre des Grenelles, the Théâtre Pigalle, the Théâtre de l'Avenue, the Théâtre Fouet Wagram. I don't hardly do French, but that's me saying that. Artaud says, and I quote once more, I personally knew intimately, and I've worked with all the prominent individuals of the theater, Luc Nepo, Sylvain, Charles Dolan, Jacques Copeau, Louis Jouvet, Georges and Ludmila Pitioff, Suzanne Desprez, Gaston Batti, Valentine Tessier, Janica Athanasiou, Roger Carl Falconetti, Renee Falconetti. Janica Athanasiou was, Artaud and her were engaged for 6 years. Janica Athanasiou, and she went on to act in movies after that. So he was there now, but here's where he becomes, a man for us. He writes, "It is not a mere list of actors, an inert record of achievements that I want to give here." I want to read that again. It is not a mere list of actors, an inert record of achievements that I want to give here, but the life and the animating spirit of the theater in France that just a few months ago gave birth to a mysterious phenomenon. In Paris in 1920, as the Vieux Colombier reopened its doors, a few great actors roamed the stage of the Comédie Française: Sylvain, Desmax, Paul Monet, etc. In avant-garde theaters, we had fun making people laugh while counteracting the tics of the great actors. We imitated the throaty, sonorous voice of Paul Monet, that big, heavy voice of Cerberus and of earthquakes, and his passive and mechanical style. We mocked the expression of Desmax's mouth and other peculiarities, such as his particular way of turning and standing up with studied attitudes. And we would say, "This is exactly what one must not do." But in my opinion, despite their quirks, these tragedians were the last to uphold the heroic traditions of the theater. And with them now dead, it must be stated, no tragedy has really been performed in Paris. All right, I want to pause there for a moment. And yes, consider that, that means a lot. But the turn comes when he speaks he speaks in the spirit of a comic. It's a comic thing he's talking about. We made fun of them. We had fun. We caricatured the peculiar mannerisms of some of the great actors of our day. It made us laugh. Artaud knew how to laugh. Artaud was a great comic. People noted it sometimes that when he wasn't the opposite, right? But his laughter at society was so open and fresh and honest and sustained and intense that the door opens from that, actually. And so Artaud is a funny fellow. And that means a whole lot, too, because you don't stop being funny even if you go mad. Well, no, you could. But if you don't, if you keep on, then on that level, then you're still able to give to life. And so that's one reason Artaud is always able to give to life. But there's more than that, because here's where he gives it. He continues to write, in the next paragraph, I will read you. But watch the turn now. Before he's talking about what he did, what they enjoyed, and how it reflected, on the aesthetics. And then he talks about the specific actors. He gives homage to them, And then he continues to describe some of their peculiarities, but now with a different kind of nuance to it. Sylvain, one of the actors, had an amusing way of wrapping his arms together at the height of the solar plexus. He also used to stress certain syllables with a slap of his chest. Desmax, without knowing the meaning of his gesture, pricked his solar eye with the tip of his index finger. He sought with that finger to find the survival of the third eye and the place of what, in the metaphysics of India, is called the pineal gland. Artaud said this. All of a sudden, an actor's gesture on the stage, subject to beautiful scorn and close studying, and close studying because it's a living transmission of the actor's art, and then his creative and playful response to that. But then it turns, and he says something like that. He used to touch his third eye, and then he opens up the door to a whole kind of metaphysical outlook, all in what he saw in that gesture. And this is why, was it the Stanislavskian exercises that gave him access to that level, of utterly changing dimension on what he was seeing, even though he was seeing the exact same world and noting the exact same details? Was it that? That was part of it. That was what allowed him to enable it and enabled him to embody it in a disciplined and focused way in that classical time-tested tradition of the educated actor. But then there's this other inner world that opens up. And yeah, theater was subjective then. Remember, this is also the time of Strindberg and the dream play. And it was Artaud's theater company that he founded himself, along with Robert Aaron and Roger Vitrock. And they staged Strindberg's dream play. They also staged Artaud's play based on Shelley's poem about the decadent Renaissance family called the Cencis. But that play that Artaud did was a flop, or it was mediocrely received, And it wasn't long after that Artaud went into the movies, and then he went to Mexico. Anyway, but so here he is describing de Max touching his third eye, the pineal gland, a whole metaphysic. This kind of thing is in the air. But here, let's listen to Artaud now tell us a little bit more about what I'm trying to say. In all such exaggerated gestures, one must see the instinctive survival of a magic whose meaning is no longer known to those who practice it. And those who laugh at it laugh without knowing why. And I would even say that if, at that moment, they could know what in them was laughing, they would be afraid of themselves. This is where we can find the reason for the movement of religious terror that seized the crowds at the Colonial Exhibition in Paris in 1931, when they could see the actor from the Balinese theater advancing toward them, and after stomping 3 or 4 times and exciting a curious upward movement of the hips, touching with his head the third eye. Now, I must say to you that this is Artaud's description of what he saw in the Balinese theater. As we know, when he saw Balinese theater, he saw such a embodied conception of the freedom, the mythic freedom, the mystical absorption that he sought in theater, which he sought to express in a sense of oneness with the audience, with the individuals who would be listening, that when he saw what he saw in Balinese theater, if you imagine what he saw in the French actor, evoking, the Chevaic third eye, when he saw the entire embodied tradition of gesture and mythology and training and everything embodied as an ensemble, and with music in the Balinese theater, the theater of Bali, that he realized, this is what I seek, and then in so many words, in so many ways, he would express what he was trying to say, what he saw in that. A theater without text, a theater composed wholly of gesture, a theater that creates the space that it is in so that the space and the expression are no longer apart from each other, and certainly the audience is no longer spectating. It's no longer a spectacle. It's the oneness of an enacted experience which overpowers anyone's sense of time or space. And this is what he saw. So he writes this, he tells us this. And now let's listen to Artaud a little bit more. He goes right back after saying this about the Balinese theater. He goes right back to de Max, the actor whom he first originally mentioned. When de Max touched his head, Artaud writes this, when de Max touched his head, we had to translate. I think with my dark head, I search in my tormented head for the lost place of thought. That is how Artaud saw de Max. The same de Max that he talks about, miming his peculiarities as a student of de Max, really, as a co-worker of de Max. Then he speaks of this, and then he paraphrases this in his beautiful poetry. I think with my dark head, I search in my tormented head for the lost place of thought. I say to you that Artaud, in that, kind of his own version of what de Max on stage is doing, with that statement, he is embodying a depiction of his sense of the disease, as he would put it, of the European mind at the with all its burnt out rationalism, and all of its cliched understandings of life, and all of its stodgy realism. It's a decadent ratio to Artaud. And that's why he searches in other places in Balinese theater, and he saw it in Mexico, which is why he had to go to Mexico. That was later. But back to Artaud, where he says to us, Max touched his head, and I think with my dark thought, right? But when the actor of the Balinese theater taps his head, we should translate, I am aware of lost pain. I point to the lost place with one eye in the head of criminal humanity. I appeal to this science that men lost in the early days of the Dark Age, that is, 60 centuries ago. Because as we know, the Dark Age for the Hindus began 3,120 years before Christ. That's him seeing the teaching or the thought of the Balinese dancer who does the same thing that he saw Max do. What a strange way to look at the world. But this is what he says, and I'm thinking about it right now. And so he goes on to say, in theater in France at this time, we have been able, almost without means, he writes, to find the secret life of the theater, just as Arthur Rimbaud knew how to discover anew the secret life of poetry. And so this gives you a taste, and a prefiguring, or a sense of the wholeness of Artaud's thought. You see, this is the kind of character that we're talking about. So some of the later things then, that further things, the deeper things that emerge in his oeuvre will make more sense to us. It's hard to go on, too hard to go on, because there's so much that I have to pick and choose. But to just take a quick detour from those fertile days of Artaud in the French theater between 1920 and 36. He learned his ascesis. He learned his discipline. He saw what was possible in it in a way no one else could. And then he demanded from them, if possible, or from himself, if possible. And what the theater could not express for him, the page would, or the thought would, or something would be enacted, to bring forth, to give birth in this explosive way. But also, there's all kinds of ways that transmits itself into culture. The work of the actor, the journeyman actor, which in itself has its roots, in medieval times, and of course before that, in the primordial days of the shamanistic times, and then in the traveling mountebanks and jugglers and troubadours and jongleurs and entertainers of medieval times, and all of this. So much lore is being transmitted at a time when all these other things are happening, in the culture of the world, but in themselves they are feeling in their bodies and bringing forth these ancient mythical vibrations that have never needed any other form but that to be passed down and to live on in the archives of the human imagination, you see. And he touched it and contributed to it out of his own self. But also, so Peter Brook, some of those filmmakers that we still hear of, in the strange movies that they made, especially in the 1970s in avant-garde cinema. Artaud, of course, is a big figure there. And then also in the spiritual side of the actor's training, of the actor's ascesis, of the actor's discipline, the spiritual esoteric qualities, which connect with all the mythical and esoteric qualities of the world, but in such a way that one can imagine them in the living space of the physical present, so to speak, in the body. And so here's Artaud, and he comes across a fellow that maybe we've heard of another legendary fellow, but this is how they relate to each other. I won't tell you who Artaud runs across, what he's describing here, but here's what he writes. He writes, in 1925, a year which seems to have been fateful for the theater, and from which a whole world will emerge, a mysterious man appeared who lived in rooms without furniture and was called the Dervish, because he claimed to have spent several years of his life among the dervishes of the Caucasus. At the revival of Pelleas et Melisande by Maeterlinck, in a scenic arrangement by Coupeau, I was surprised by an extraordinary lighting system. Now the light truly lived, smelled, gave off an odor, had become a kind of new personage. The light, and bringing light to his sets and his actors, seemed to be the last of the dervishes' concerns. A light that does not illuminate, and from which seems to emanate a strong smell, there is in it, I thought, a rare spirit. Let me read that again. Artaud is saying, he's talking about a set of theater lights and what he sees in them and the personage that is connected with him. But he says this again. Artaud writes, a light that does not illuminate, and from which seems to emanate a strong smell, there is in it, I thought, a rare spirit. And of course, Artaud is gifted with a certain kind of a way of knowing, and certainly synesthesia is a natural thing. He's describing it as something that's very natural and everyday. He doesn't say, this is synesthesia, but he's talking about light, which gives off a certain smell. So back to Artaud, who writes, after talking about his fascination with this quality of light, a psychic light, and yet a light that does not illuminate. Anyway, Artaud writes, and one evening in a cafe, 100 yards from the theater, I found myself before an irascible character with a large mustache, his face twisted like a vine branch, who answered with insults every question that was put to him. And in the midst of these insults, at times, a strange idea of nature and life seemed to emerge. In the midst of these insults, a strange idea of nature and life seemed to emerge. Suddenly I'm reminded, Artaud is aware that life is funny, So he mentioned, who is he talking? This is Gurdjieff. That's I wanted to tell you that. He never says it's Gurdjieff, but it's Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff, Artaud quotes him as saying, when they talked in a cafe later on, he replied, would you believe that those fools could not see that light was sensitivity, that there is no light without sensitivity? Would you believe that those fools cannot see that light is sensitivity and that there is no light without sensitivity? Ooh, that's one of Gurdjieff's esoteric teachings. And Artaud relates that, and I quote, for over 3 hours, walking from Place de l'Alma to Gare Saint-Lazare, we spent a terrible February night together talking. They were only idiots for him. Life, in the minds of present-day humanity, was no more than an obscure notion. And the men of the theater were the dumbest of all. Those dark lights that have moved you, he said to me, they find them too dark. It is because they have not yet touched a notion superior to that of the 5 senses. Smell, taste, touch, sight, hearing. As if the theater was not made to transgress the world of the senses. The life of the senses, we live it daily. If the theater does not help us to surpass ourselves, what will it be used for? Artaud has Gurdjieff saying this, but you know that Artaud is paraphrasing his own thought, in his little story here of Gurdjieff. And I'll read one more little quote from this part here. Artaud continues that story. Artaud says, and then I spoke to him about a lost language that could be found in the theater. His response was that poetry, true poetry, and not the poetry of poets, keeps this language secret. And some sacred dances come closer to the secret of this poetry than any other language. That's Gurdjieff talking about those dances, those diagrammed and structured dances that Peter Brook, a disciple of Artaud, a later filmmaker, in his classic 1970s movie Meetings with Remarkable Men, about Gurdjieff and his mythical story that he told about himself, about traveling to the Caucasus looking for a monastery where the lost knowledge would be taught. And that movie, with all of its aspects of it, was filmed in such a way that it was an expression or depiction of the thought of Gurdjieff. And Peter Brook, as I said, is a disciple of Artaud in a certain sense. They learned. So this is the way that knowledge is passed down from generation unto generation. I can only give the slightest hint of it here when I'm talking about this aspect of Artaud in the theater sense. I can step on beyond that, though. I've mentioned the movies that he was in. I want to mention now his association in Paris with the Surrealists. And so much could be written about that, and his relationship with the tumultuous publicity hounds and the strange and legendary characters and all the strange ways that they made themselves known in society. Eventually, as they did with so many, André Breton would adopt people and celebrate them and then excommunicate them. And Artaud and he fell out over Marxism and all of this. Not that Artaud was not anything but a revolutionary, but he was totally his own kind of revolutionary. And he thought it was so clear that when the Surrealists began to go head over heels with Marxism and what they thought that it was all about, Artaud realized, well, this is a turn in this for them, and that it is not my turn to take, because my point, my row to hoe, is that which comes from within me, and so they had a falling out. But then they still kept on. They are still connected, and you see that later on. And maybe we'll look at that a little bit more. Maybe, I don't know, because I want to talk though a little bit about some of the things that Artaud did have to say about surrealism. Because you still see those characteristic ideas in him. So this is also a lecture that he gave in Mexico City. The one I had before was the relation of the French theater. And we looked at some of the ways it was very, very interesting and instructive as to the strange gift of Artaud. Well, now let's look at some of his lectures delivered in Mexico about surrealism and revolution. Just on a historical note, Artaud writes, I participated in the surrealist movement from 1924 to 1926, and I was involved in its violence. I will speak of it with the spirit that I had at that time, and I will attempt to revive for you that spirit which wanted to be blasphemous and sacrilegious, and which sometimes succeeded. But you say that this spirit has died. Remember, he's talking to perhaps students. The French ambassador was in the audience in Mexico City in 1936. Now, he says, but you say that this spirit has died. It belongs to 1926, and if you respond, just respond to 1926. Surrealism was born out of despair and a disgust, and it was born on school benches. Far more than a literary movement, it was a moral revolt, the organic cry of man, the kicks of life in us against all coercion. The entire surrealist movement was a profound and inner kind of insurrection. But then, in so many words, well, I cannot paraphrase the way that he talks about when it falls prey to the materialist conception of the times, which he saw was exemplified, among other things, in Marxism. That was when he realized that when they turned toward the social aspect of that, as Marxism addresses, as good as it is in its own way, artistically, it is a capitulation to rationalism and the destructive effect and the decadent effect of the European decadence, upon poetic thought. And he wouldn't have it. But at the same time, he still would say, things like this. I quote again, "But the mystery of surrealism is that this revolt from the start sank into the unconscious. It has been a concealed mysticism, a new kind of occultism, and like all concealed mysticism, it expressed itself allegorically and through larvae that took on the air of poetry. All that which had the form of a clear claim, surrealism dismissed or could not align with." And yet he speaks of it as once having been a soldier in the ranks. He writes, Artaud says, "In this revolt we engaged our soul, and we engaged it materially. Yet this revolt, which attacked everything, was not capable of destroying anything, at least in appearance. Because the secret of surrealism is that it attacks things in their secrecy. The secret of surrealism is that it attacks things in their secrecy." To reach the secret of things, surrealism had opened a path. Like with the unknown god of the mysteries of the Kabires, like with Ein Sof, the animated whole of the abysses in the Kabbalah, like with the nothing, the void, the non-being devourer of the nothingness of the ancient Brahmins and Vedas, we can say of surrealism what it is not. But to say what it is, one must use approximations and images. And surrealism is a movement clothed in images. It resuscitates by a sort of incantation in the void, the spirit of ancient allegories. So there we have what connects, as an ascesis, as Artaud sees, as is embodied in Artaud's imagination, as an ascesis. The surrealism opens up a path, a path in all the dramatic ways that he spoke of, but it's connected by way of the ancient allegories, by the presence in the same poetic energy that is in the ancient allegories, which give us a world in and of itself, a subterranean world, which has always existed parallel to the world of rationalism, you see. And of course, in the theatrical writings, he was talking about the third eye, the pineal gland, Balinese theater, And so you see that these are the ways this thought moves in all these different kind of artistic currents and things. And this is what makes him an exemplary figure. If we study surrealism, that's a door to Artaud. If we study theater and the theater craft, the work of the actor, that's a door to Artaud. And the doors lead to, among other things, a world of a unique mind which naturally expresses itself in the esoteric language of the ancient allegories, a timeless mind. This is the way knowledge is passed from generation unto generation. As William Blake said, a fellow thinker in this vein, right? This is the kind of knowingness that I want to touch on. So, and that too, I want to say that the mystique of Artaud, the diabolical, dangerous one, is real and true, and the suffering is real. But at the same time, no, as Allen Ginsberg said offhand, you don't want to be Artaud. But Artaud is an inspiring figure because he's an analogic thinker. He's a mystic. And he embodies oceans of history. And he connects those oceans of history to this particular explosive, tumultuous, and fascinating time. Paris, immediately before and after the Second World War. And in so many ways. And so in that way, he's such a teacher to us. And we know he means it. We know what he really wants to contribute to. Yes, yes, he's crazy, but he gives of himself, and always did. There were periods of extreme and lucid creativity, even when he was completely mad and suffering. We'll have to just give a quick rundown of that at some point. Of course, a little bit more. But let's talk about a few quotations from Artaud himself. Theater is a practice which wakes us up, nerves and heart. Theater inspires us with the fiery magnetism of its images and acts upon us and acts upon us like a spiritual therapeutics whose touch can never be forgotten. So here's a characteristic statement which we have to pay attention to. This is a sign tag. Artaud is known for the theater of cruelty. Cruelty sounds good in English. Cruelty sounds good in French. It's a dramatic kind of thing. And Artaud is a barnstormer. He comes on so strong, to the detriment of his earthly well-being, at times. And so he's going to. That's why he's going to say the theater of cruelty. But you can just as much say that a theater of necessity. You can just as much say a theater of intensity. You can just as much say a theater of danger. You could, but although that you would be a different personality than Artaud. With Artaud, it had to be a theater of cruelty. So here's another thing. Here's another thought, another poetic thought from Artaud himself. He expressing and defining one of the terms associated with him. The theater of cruelty has been created in order to restore to the theater a passionate and convulsive conception of life. And it is in this sense of violent rigor and extreme condensation of scenic elements that the cruelty on which it is based must be understood. This cruelty, which can be bloody when necessary, but not systematically so, can thus be identified with a kind of severe moral purity, which is not afraid to pay life the price it must be paid. So he says it real explicitly right there. He wants to restore a passionate and convulsive conception of life. And passionate, which means pain, and convulsive, as Breton said, beauty will be convulsive or not at all. A passionate and convulsive conception of life. This was Artaud's role. And so he played that role. And we understand the way that we can take it and understand it. It's also in the sense of the ancient allegories. And he's also a mystic. So when he talks about God or the devil or any of these things, there will be blasphemy. Because it's that kind of what comes out will come out, He's a Manichean. Allen Ginsberg did also say that offhand, but you can see that ultimately so many are. As much as he inveighed against European rationalism and all of this, spiritually there is still a parallel cul-de-sac of the absolute duality between mind and soul, or flesh and spirit, which is simply just the dramatic polarity between which the soul mediates. These are religious truths put into traditional religious terms. But with Artaud, the soul expresses its being through joy and sadness and laughter, and also through suffering, and also through utter rebellion and blasphemy and crime. The sin against the spirit is blasphemy. But you can still blaspheme the blasphemer. And to blaspheme the blasphemer is to be able to say, Artaud, you're you, and I'm me, and that's all right, And there is love there. There's always love. Like I say, Artaud, later on in his life, he became... you wouldn't have these open doors into all of these, really voluminous kind of esoteric kind of evocations later on in his life. And when I say later on in his life, after he comes back from Mexico, he's in Paris, but he's become truly a seer, but in a certain sense, he's more and more kind of crazy, and more in his own kind of voices and frankly and truly delusions. And then he conceives of an insane delusion that he has come into the possession of the cane given by Jesus to a hermit on the Tyrrhenian Sea, who was told by Jesus, "O hermit, give this cane to St. Patrick." And then hundreds of years later, St. Patrick came and received that cane. And it's been lost to history. But Artaud, after he got back from Mexico, he was often homeless, and he he had the cane. He tipped it with brass so that when he walked on the sidewalk, sparks would come from it. And he began to get a little bit scary. And he said he was going to return that cane to the Irish people. And so he went to Ireland in about 1937 for a short time, I think for about 8 weeks. And he spent time all in the country. He loved to sing, S-Y-N-G, and the whole kind of Celtic spirit and all of this. And a lot of time homeless, and a lot of time, I guess, the laudanum and in Dublin. And the cane, he decided, he was going to give it back to who he was going to give it back to. Well, he showed up at the gate of the Jesuit college in Dublin, and that's where there was some altercation kind of happened, and the police had to come. And the cane was lost, and Artaud got beat up. And then he was in the same jail that some of the revolutionaries were in. And then he was on a ship deported, on a steamship going back to Le Havre. And he arrived in Le Havre in a straitjacket. There was a further altercation on board the ship where he was under the impression that some of the deckhands were trying to harm him. And so he ended up in a straitjacket. And then he was institutionalized. Sadly enough, he spent all through the war years, this was 1937 or so, and he was institutionalized, you could say, for the rest of his life, in varying degrees of severity, though. And there were times when it was very rough and he did not create. But then there were other times when he did. And the restrictions on him relaxed so that in the latter part of his life, he was able to live on the grounds, kind of in a groundskeeper's place, a groundskeeper's hut or whatever, on the grounds at Ivry in near Paris. And he was able to come and go as he pleased, actually. And he wasn't they loved him so much, those who were loyal to him, among them the old surrealists and things, and André Gide and Albert Camus and all the people he knew when he worked in the theater and everything, and all the people he corresponded with, from Mexico back and forth. So that he did some great works, but like I was beginning to say, they were more, at times he was so deeply involved in his own siege against black magic. You couldn't shake his hand. He would hold out 2 fingers, But when that kind of abated, then he would perform, and he was totally himself, but and totally giving, but of what was in him, and compelling as it is, it is also, yes, but we hear this on the street, at times, the things that you hear in life. And Artaud is there too, he's the ultimate wounded healer, it's true. But you got to look at it like that too, because the human connection is there, The black magical sieges, in a certain sense, were kept to himself, exhibited in weird kind of ritualistic, kind of repetitive behaviors, I guess. No one can say exactly what it was. It kind of collapsed in on itself. So much so, though, that the artistic expressions were just so of the body, of that moment, neologisms, many neologisms, a voice, because of the electroshock treatments that he did endure, 50 electroshock treatments, there was no more teeth, in his head. And so his persona, a beautiful human being face, and you would see, if you see the movie The Passion of Joan of Arc and some of the other things that are available out there that you can see, well, now he's the old, warlock. He's aged so much, and he's only, in his early 50s. But the voice has no middle range anymore. The teeth are gone. There's the basso profundo, and then there's the shriek and the weird cackle and the animalistic and the inhuman and the blasphemous. It's quite scary, and at the same time, they're still coming through this notion of like, what has come forth is so real that what it leaves behind is only just the vehicle of it. And the vehicle carries the spirit in a certain sense. When I say Manichean, it's like his psyche was a living sacrifice to the inner truth of the spirit, and that's true. But it was also negated because, of course, he was an artiste and he was a blasphemer and all of these things, but truly a spiritual being. And still a teacher. It's up to us, though, to understand the wholeness of it. And we can see into that just like Dr. Toulouse did from the very beginning. let's talk about that a little bit. But just before that, I have to tell you and mention it only briefly. One of the chiefest reasons for this talk has been this lovely book about Artaud's journey to Mexico, um, put out by the Contra Mundum Press, um, edited by Stuart Kendall, translated by Robert Hanshi. And it's a collection of Artaud's writings and everything, letters, lectures, and other writings, poems connected with his journey to Mexico. And it spends a lot of time on that, talking about it. And I hardly allude to it, but I think what I want to say, just as concisely as I can, about how Artaud's trip to Mexico stacks up in relation to his to his work, as we have kind of like outlined it a little bit. To me, this is where Artaud, the poetic seer, embodies what he saw in the Balinese theater, a totality of expression, wordless. Well, when Artaud begins to see in the landscape of the Tarahumara, when he sees in the shadows and the shards and the rocks and the shadows, he sees all of these living shapes, and the synesthesia is all there, so that the writing is truly at the very most superficial. It's beautiful prose poetry, and at the next level, it is the organic speech of a living 20th century individual of the language of the ancient allegories. To me, storytelling to me, in the most sublime and holistic sense, where the speaking is every word is of the natural world, and at the same time the natural world as an image of a world that we cannot see with our eyes, and an image of a drama that we can only know it by like having it just come forth from us no matter what. That was the aspect of the convulsiveness of it, And so when he spoke about theater of cruelty, it doesn't mean sadistic or anything like that, but it means like when he speaks of like violence and everything, fundamentally, it is absolutely his extreme take on the Dionysian kind of like the Dionysian side of the whole theatrical endeavor and the poetic endeavor, where you are torn apart and you're dismembered and you merge and you mingle into all of this and you lose yourself and you are threshed and fermented and changed and you emerge again, but no matter what, the price is paid, is at the very least of it. The sacrifice is made. To sacrifice means to make sacred. It is in the language of he's an extreme character, but at the same time, it is a real embodiment of the Dionysian kind of mythos. Oh, but he's a genius transcending even that, because you must understand the Apollinian side of things is in the unyielding clarity and severe focus amidst all of this dismemberment, all of this threshing, all of this loss of oneself. The God of rebirth, of death and rebirth and of dying and the cyclical enactment is there. At the same time, there is a level sight looking out and seeing the basic lineaments of a coordinated horizon and expressing that in such clear and precise terms that it becomes kind of like just a living kind of like magnetic polarity, between these two kind of archetypal ways of being one's artwork, such that it's truly uncanny, And of course, it's perverse, and that will fascinate. It's perverse in so many ways. Can't talk about that without mentioning a little bit of the writing. I won't read all of Artaud's. One of his most characteristic writings is a prose piece called "The Mountain of Signs." I don't think I will read all of that because I can only kind of just maybe give you a taste of that. Um, because there's also a preliminary essay um, where I love what he says. It's also kind of like about the landscape when he finally gets to the land of the Tarahumara in northern Mexico, these canyons where the people, where they inhabit. And they did expel the colonialists, even the Jesuits. I wonder if he went to them because in their history, they defeated and drove away a lot of the Jesuit colonization and all of the Spanish colonization. They held out for a long period of time, partially because of the isolation of their land. And of course, this is what Artaud saw, that this was, so therefore that their ceremonialism, their rites and their way of looking at the world and their way of enacting, was like the primordial purity that he sought in the Balinese theater. But he wanted to find it on the ground, in the Tarahumara. So that's how he conceived of this whole trip in so many ways to Mexico. He departed for Mexico. He was about 40 or so. On my father's birthday, January 10th, 1936, my father was born 7 years before that. So when my father was 7, Artaud set forth, on January 10th, 1936. He crossed the Atlantic, and they didn't call it detox back then. He went cold turkey on the Atlantic, and by the time he arrived in Veracruz on February 7th, my mother's birthday, he had kicked, he had taken the cure, so to speak, in the harsh way, all by himself. And then in Mexico City, he began using again and was living in Mexico City, sometimes on the streets and in the cafes and sometimes with friends, and writing these essays and writing these lectures. And he did not know Spanish. And so they were translated sometimes on the spot in cafes. And sometimes he was homeless, and sometimes he was a little bit, he would spit at unknown enemies when he walked down the street. And sometimes people said he was like, they called him El Mumo. Did they? I think it was that word, mumia, because he was like almost catatonic sitting in cafes. That was the impression that some people had of him. And yet he was putting out these writings, many of which that I've read from and were collected and gathered here. So, yeah, it's superhuman and all of that stuff in that legendary way. But if you look at the thought itself, take the thought, it doesn't have to be connected with any legendary personality for the meaning of the thought to be so enriching for us. That's the kind of purity that I'm talking about, this Apollonian in focus, which is truly all human beings, no matter how sick they are, in their creativity, there's always the possibility that a sensitive understander of what they produce creatively, one can see into their true essence and see it as God-given and healthy. And Artaud's work exemplifies that for us. And in that way, he is contributing a great deal of living energy to us. And yet he fascinates us because he's such a sick puppy, in all these different ways. And so, but let that be. That's acting, you see. That's legend. That's the stuff of legend. Legend also means lie, the truth and the lie. Fame is the sum of misconceptions that gather around the name of certain people. Rilke said something like that. Anyway, in an early essay, he writes about the Renaissance-like light, the blue, I think it is. I think it's the blue that he sees in the sky and in the light of the land of the Tarahumara. Was that shade, that essence of blue first conceived of by the Renaissance painters, Fra Angelico and others. And it in and of itself was an outgrowth of the way that knowledge is passed down from age unto age. In the medieval times, the secret knowledge was transmitted through the techniques of art. And it was the painters, the religious painters, who brought forth from their inspiration this particular blue, which I, Artaud, paraphrasing, see now in the land of the Tarahumara. I just want to mention when Artaud speaks of the color blue, it means so much to me, synesthesically and spiritually as a symbol in all these different ways. Can't describe it, of course. But anyway, here's a little bit of prose from Artaud. This is from The Mountain of Signs. The land of the Tarahumara is full of signs, of forms, and of natural effigies that in no way seem the result of chance, as if the gods, whom one feels everywhere here, had chosen to signify their powers by means of these strange signatures, wherein the figure of man is hunted down from all sides. Of course, there are places on the earth where nature, moved by a kind of intelligent whim, has sculptured human forms, but here the case is different, for it is over the whole geographic expanse of a race that nature has chosen to speak. And then he describes the shadows, tortured people. When I'm continuing to read a little bit later in some prose. When a whole country of stone develops a philosophy parallel to that of its men, when one knows that the first men utilized a language of signs, and when one finds this language formidably expanded on the rocks, surely one cannot then continue to think that this is a whim, and that this whim signifies nothing. If the greater part of the Tarahumara race is autochthonos, and if, as they claim, they fell out of the sky into the Sierra, one may say that they fell into a nature that was already prepared. And this nature chose to think like a man. Just as she evolved men, she also evolved rocks. And the rocks are living hieroglyphs. I don't want to go on too much because I know that the time is approaching where I must leave off for now. But I want to show you, or relate to you a little bit. This is Artaud in some of his later times, where, in the words of Guide, who saw Artaud's last performance, here's Guide writing about Artaud. To me, he had never seemed more admirable. Of his material existence, nothing remained except what was expressive. His ungainly figure, his face consumed by inner fire, his hands that knot themselves tighter, whether held out towards unreachable help or twisting in anguish, more often tightly shielding his face, alternately hiding and revealing it, openly signaling abominable human distress, a sort of unreprievable damnation, with no possible escape, except into frantic lyricism, nothing of which could reach the audience except scatological flashes, curses, and blasphemies. Certainly the marvelous actor this artist could become was rediscovered, but it was his own personality he was offering to the audience with a sort of shameless barnstorming that did not conceal a total authenticity. This was André Gide writing about Artaud's last performance less than a year before he died in Paris, where, he said stuff like this: that sinister appearance of morbid cruelty that God adopts whenever he is pleased to patronize modern humanity, as he is doing now, he utilizes the spirit of purity of a consciousness that has remained candid, like mine, to asphyxiate it with all the false appearances that he spreads universally through space. This is why Artaud le Momo can be taken for a person suffering from hallucinations. I mean that I have found the way to put it into the charade once and for all, and although nobody believes in God no more, everybody believes more and more in man, so it is man whom we must now make up our minds to emasculate. To place him upon the autopsy table, to remake his anatomy, I dare say remake his anatomy. Man is sick because he is badly constructed. We must make up our minds to strip him bare and scrape off and rid him of all that animalcule that itches him mortally. I mean God, along with God, scrape off and rid him of his organs. When you have made him a body without his organs, then you will have delivered him from all the autocratic reactions and restored to him his true freedom. And then he will know how to dance one side out. He will know again how to dance one side out, as in the frenzy of the dance halls. And this one side will be his real place. That's the French metacritics love that. And then I'll just read one more thing about Artaud, because I want to show you also his, I don't want to call it naive side, but Artaud wrote that, which is almost, to me, it's painful to read. I hope it's not too alienating for you. But here's a sweet thing. Well, yeah, There's Artaud in his address to the Dalai Lama. Now, the 13th Dalai Lama, or the one Dalai Lama before the current Dalai Lama alive now, that was the one who foresaw the destruction, of Tibet and all of this. And then the Dalai Lama, who is still presently the Dalai Lama that we know, was quite young when he was deemed the Dalai Lama. And I think, I'm not totally sure, but I think that Artaud is writing this to the same Dalai Lama that is still amongst us now. Addressed to the Dalai Lama. This is by Artaud. We are your most faithful servants, O Grand Lama. Give us grace. Grace us with your illuminations in a language our contaminated European minds can understand, and if need be, transform our mind. Create for us a mind turned entirely toward those perfect summits where the human mind no longer suffers. Make us a mind without habits, a mind truly frozen in the mind, or a mind with purer habits, your habits, if they can help us toward freedom. We are surrounded by bellowing popes, poetasters, critics, dogs. Our mind has gone to the dogs who think directly in terms with the earth, who think incorrigibly in the present. Teach us, O Lama, the physical levitation of matter and how we may no longer be earthbound. For you well know what transparent liberation of souls, what freedom of the mind, in the mind, we mean, O acceptable Pope, O true Pope in the mind. With the inward eye, I contemplate you, O Pope, on the inward summit. It is inwardly that I am like you. I, dust, idea, lip, levitation, dream, cry, renunciation of idea, suspended among all the forms, and hoping for nothing but the wind. In about 1936. No, about I don't know when. 1930. Before going to Mexico, I think, Artaud was at the Sorbonne. He was giving a performance about theater of the plague. There was someone in the audience who reflected later on it, and she said, I was trying to follow his thought. It seemed he was talking about the plague and how suffering makes us surpass ourselves. The fear of death makes us become immortal, or brings to us a certain extremity of creativity, or shatters the forms of what we were so that what emerges is truly whole, even amidst the suffering. I was thinking I was following his thought, when all of a sudden, he began to shake and shudder. Artaud, on the stage, began to shake and shudder. He fell down. The sweat poured off of him. His eyes dilated. His hands clenched. I could feel the parchedness of his throat, the fire in his guts. I could see the delirium. He was delirious. He was shouting. He was stammering. He was gesticulating. He was dying. He was dying on stage. And he became still, and he continued to shudder and shake. And he went through the entire process, I could understand now, of someone dying of plague. The audience, at first they gasped. They were shocked. But then as he went on, during the whole process, they began to jeer. They began to hoot. They began to laugh. And one after the other, and then in crowds, they got up, talking loudly amongst themselves, and jeering and shouting and leaving the theater. And he did not stop. Artaud did not stop until he had died and lay still. And there was only a few of us left in the audience. And then when he was dead, he stood up and he walked toward me and he kissed my hand. And we walked together into the streets of Paris, and we went to a cafe, and we talked and we spoke. And he was truly bewildered about what had happened. He was hurt. He was angry. I died to show them about the plague. They want to hear about the plague and the theory of the plague. And when I begin to show them the actuality of what I'm really trying to say by becoming that, they laugh and they jeer. He spat on the ground. He was angry. He was hurt. He was all of these things. He was Artaud. Then we talked about Mexico. We talked about D.H. Lawrence. We talked about this primordial kind of life. Who gives us a story? Anais Nin. Anais Nin was there. She's the one who describes this performance. And so I just wanted to just leave off with that. And on behalf, of Artaud's, the way that he touched us all, I honor everything that he still continues to give us today, and I see so much of it all around me sometimes. I give this talk partially so I can learn to continue to see it, and I hope you do too. So I thank you for your heroic listening. And I say to you, so long for now.